It's the spooky season once again. And although I haven't really done this in the past, I figured this year we should embrace it and look at a spooky game. So you know those games that you rented a few times as a kid but you never made it too far into them? For me, that description fits all of the Ghosts and Goblins games that I've had access to over the years. Maximo is at least Ghosts and Goblins adjacent, and it's the only one of those games that I never revisited years later, so what the hell? Let's look at how an American game development studio revisited a Tokudo Fujiwara classic years later on the PlayStation 2.
Sophia!
Maximo! Achille, you told me Maximo—
Silence!
That's enough, Achille!
You little fool! I control your kingdom now, as I control the power of the underworld.
Sophia!
Behold, my dark power!
Maximo starts off with our hero, the king, Maximo. Returning from an off-screen war, he finds out that his trusted advisor is attempting to take over the kingdom by forcing Queen Sophia to marry him. Luckily, the game starts us halfway through a typical Ghosts and Goblins playthrough, so Maximo immediately confronts the bad guy only to be kicked back to the start of the game. You know, by getting killed. The evil advisor's plan involves harvesting all the souls of the undead by drilling down to hell. And the dead roaming the earth would be pretty bad for Death. So Death himself gives Maximo another shot at saving the day, reviving him and giving him a bargaining chip to return back to life again should it ever be needed. The Ghosts and Goblins games are notorious for their high difficulty and how unforgiving they are, and to make sure that a new generation of players would be familiar with this, the main character goes game over before the opening cutscene ends. It's a good way to set the tone for the adventure because if Maximo is one thing, it's unforgiving. Though at least not to a point it gets too absurd during a regular playthrough. The basic gameplay of Maximo is very straightforward. Much like Arthur in Super Ghouls and Ghosts, Maximo gets a double jump. Though this being a 3D platformer and the challenges in those being different than a 2D platformer, this jump is a lot more floaty and less rigid, giving you some more leniency when jumping from platform to platform. Which is interesting in and of itself considering the addition of a double jump made Super Ghouls and Ghosts a lot easier to manage than the original Ghosts and Goblins was. The typical spear projectile attack has been replaced with a sword and shield, which adds more nuance and complexity to the combat in a lot of ways. Attacks are divided between horizontal and vertical slashes, with the regular horizontal attack quickly comboing into a second slash once you found the permanent buff for it. The vertical slash turns into a forward thrust if you use it while running, and also becomes a downward thrust, acting like a Mario 64 ground pound when used after a double jump. There's also a regular horizontal aerial attack, which, like a lot of action games, can be used to quickly do 2 attacks if you attack right before landing in front of the enemy. There's also a crouching attack, which becomes extremely valuable in the late game but isn't too important early on. Now, where things get interesting is how these attacks are all used. Most games having a vertical and horizontal attack on different buttons use these to alternate between the two for combo routines, going into different paths with your attacks as you press 2 buttons in different orders, but not here. In Maximo, a lot of enemies will hold weapons like spears or hammers in front of them, blocking the horizontal attacks, so you have to go in with a vertical attack to do damage to them. Other enemies need to be hit repeatedly within a short time frame, so the repeated attacks of horizontal slashes are the key to taking them down, especially when they're in groups, as the vertical slash leaves you wide open after using it. Some enemies carry shields, forcing you to wait until they've attacked so they let their guard down before you go in with your own attacks. Slam the wrong attack into an enemy guard, or just about any solid object immune to sword slashes, and you get staggered, leaving Maximo vulnerable to any incoming attacks for a while. Skeletons tend to get knocked down after enough hits, requiring a downward thrust to finish them off, but a downward thrust is a slow and cumbersome attack, leaving you exposed to attacks from enemies if there's groups of them. And that's not even getting into things like crows trying to steal your money, ghosts trying to steal your souls, both swooping in from large distances. Skeletons throwing their shields at you, or worse, the ones throwing bombs who will explode if you attack them from a melee range. Maximo demands that you take down enemies in various specific ways, and not just by understanding how to dodge their attacks and then go in for your own. You have to use the correct attack when it's the right time. It's very punishing if you go in with the wrong attack type, but never in a way that becomes so punishing as to become unfair. And a good part of that is how they handled health. Health in Maximo is done very well. In most of the Ghosts and Goblins games, taking a hit removes your armor, leaving you to run around in your boxers. That's technically kept intact, but in a much more lenient form. Instead of immediately being stripped down, every tier of armor is its own health bar. So the standard health you start the game with has Maximo fully clad in armor. Once you pick up an upgrade, he gets a helmet on top of that. Take enough damage to empty out a health bar, you go down one armor tier, all the way down to your boxers, just like the old games Maximo is based on. If you're fully armored and find another upgrade on top of that, you become invulnerable for 20 seconds before reverting back to the helmet tier. It's a nice middle ground between the Ghosts and Goblins arcade-focused armor system where one hit takes you all the way down, and a contemporary platformer way of having a health bar. For a straightforward action platformer, there's a lot of things to keep in mind at all times as the game keeps up the pressure by spawning more enemies over time. Thankfully, these spawns aren't infinite or random or anything. The same enemies always appear in the same locations. But you're never sure if the amount of enemies you see in front of you will be all the ones that you're facing at any given time. Some might spawn in just as you engage with the enemy, and some might rise from their grave just as you've taken down a group. You don't always have to fight the enemies, most of the time you could just run ahead and ignore them. But sometimes they're going to be in the way of a jump you're not sure about even during the best of times. It creates an atmosphere of pressure that is much harsher than the actual difficulty of the game itself is, while also pushing for the kind of familiarity created through repeated playthroughs in the way a traditional Ghosts and Goblins games does. Another good indication of this is how the completion percentages are called mastery. Maximo wants you to master it. The kind of mastery that can only happen from repeated attempts at levels, repeated exposure to the same enemies and problems. There's a few other ways this gets reinforced, and one of them is a thing I've seen criticism about looking at other coverage of Maximo at the time: the way saving your game is handled. Maximo is divided in 5 worlds, each with their own hub area, and the hub area has a save point. Using that save point, however, costs 100 coins. That's a pretty steep sum. I've seen the argument made that this is unfair because if you save your game after every level you'll be poverty-stricken for the rest of the playthrough, but that's missing the point of why that save point is there, while also underlining that they might not have gotten past the first world with their time in the game. After every world, you get a free save point. It takes about an hour to get through a world the first time you play it, taking your time, and about 30 minutes or less if you're familiar with the game and know how to blaze through most obstacles. Levels generally take between 5 or 10 minutes at best. It's not that big of a deal to redo one. The game clearly wants you to replay the stages and master them to get that save spot with a decent amount of lives, continues, and items before saving. Losing an hour at most on an action game that greatly reduces its length upon replaying it because you know what you're doing isn't too bad. Especially since as long as you've improved, you've not really lost that hour. You gain more familiarity and skill, giving you more of an edge for the later content. Not to mention that you're likely going to end up with more armor, money, and continue coins. To me, the paid save locations feel like they're there in case you really need to stop playing right now and you don't want to lose progress on a run that's going especially well. A last resort that you shouldn't use, but sometimes life happens and you need to put the controller down. So the option is there, but it isn't encouraged. The other way mastery is reinforced, and that's another point people get heated over, is the continue system. At the start of the game, the Grim Reaper brings you back to life and promises that as long as you have a special continue coin on you, you get to continue your quest.
Alright.
When it's time to make do on that promise though, he tells you he's raising the price the next time you need him.
What? You're back so soon? Next time, the price increases.
So every time you continue, it's going to cost 1 more credit than the last time. Some of this feels like a joke about credit feeding in old arcade games. After a while, you lose track of how much money you've poured into the machine once you've let go of yourself and stopped trying to preserve your lives. But technically, it's close to how the continues system in Super Ghouls and Ghosts already worked on the Super Nintendo. The game gave you more continues based on score racked up without dying, to give you more of a shot at the final stretch of the game. In a title where you already had to play through the adventure twice for a full playthrough to begin with. Maximo's continue system makes it clear that yes, you can continue, but no, we don't want you to make a habit of this. Credits aren't too hard to come by, and you can farm them easily enough if you want to. The stages are littered with graves, and destroying those gives you 5 souls each. Every 50 souls, you get a credit. But farming souls will only get you so far as the price keeps creeping up on you. They don't want players to power through the game beyond what they can get past through actual skill and understanding, instead of that one lucky run after wasting a ton of continues on the single stage. And I think that's a lot fairer than people tend to give this design choice credit for. But one of the biggest and most immediate ways mastery is pushed is the buff system. You get a ton of buffs in this game, and the majority of them feel like they're natural extensions to your kit in such a way that it's hard to imagine playing without them. You get to turn your regular horizontal slash into a double slash. You can throw your shield at the cost of its durability to take care of certain enemies safely. You can magnetize your shield so it pulls in more money from a distance. There's elemental buffs for your regular attacks to increase their damage output. There's a lot of buffs. A lot of buffs. But die once and you lose most of them. A good chunk of buffs drop semi-randomly from enemies upon killing them, so getting them back soon after losing isn't guaranteed. This doesn't necessarily make the game that much harder, it only means that you have to play a bit more conservatively until you scale back to your old power curve. But the way the game's flow naturally speeds up upon getting buffs ensures the player becomes overconfident and prone to mistakes. It's pretty clever design and not too far off from what the higher tier armor and better weapons in Super Ghouls and Ghosts did. Thankfully, the buffs you get to keep are the most core ones, so you don't have to regain those upon dying. Unless you do a certain thing. After every boss fight, you free one of the trapped sorceresses. They'll present you with one of 3 options. You can save your game, get a kiss, or have an armor upgrade. Saving your game does the obvious, and the armor upgrade restores 1 tier of armor. The kiss is a useless buff that does nothing and takes up a permanent buff slot, locking you out of a core ability. Clearing the game with all the kisses unlocks an image gallery. It's a pretty bad reward for this kind of challenge. And obviously the best option is to just save your game, so the next time you play or whenever you go game over, you can continue from the start of the next world. You could pick armor and save your game later, but you can find armor for free a lot of the time. You won't find a free save slot. But if it's mastery you want, choosing neither armor or a save point and effectively locking you out of an ability for the rest of the playthrough, that's a good challenge mode right there. Even if the extrinsic reward isn't worth the effort, and funnily enough, it does play back into how that second loop of a Ghosts and Goblins playthrough goes, when you have to beat the game with a downgraded kit. But challenge isn't the only thing that's worth talking about with Maximo, and I think in terms of atmosphere, this game is hugely underrated. It's a very nice looking game with a lot of environmental variety and some great attention to detail. Something that I especially appreciate is how the send-ups to the original games are handled, the most obvious being the look and feel of the first world, with the ground rising and falling as you move forward, graves bursting out of the ground to dump new enemies on you, evil wizards popping out of chests. But even the second world, when the theming changes, is still based on the second half of the first stage. The hazardous vines blocking the path that regrow quickly after cutting them down make that pretty much clear. It's a bit less direct, but the influences are still clearly there. The world after this is a ship graveyard, something that goes back to the second stage of the original. Even the throne room at the end looks very familiar. At the very least, Maximo is nowhere near as difficult as the older titles. It's not exactly easy either, but playing through the game I felt like a lot of the talk about the difficulty from the old days was a bit overblown. If anything is a real enemy here, it's the camera at times. Though even that isn't as bad as it's often made out to be. Although you can't freely rotate the camera, you get to recenter it behind Maximo, which is more than enough in most cases. The level design is very reminiscent of the original 3 Crash Bandicoot games, a straight line moving forward. There are some more paths here and some more side treasures, but usually the way forward is quite literally in front of you, and if it isn't, it's a straight line right around the corner. Recentering the camera behind you is more than enough to deal with most obstacles. Though, maybe it's because I'm an idiot, but I didn't immediately notice this was a thing. Holding down the button that recenters the camera lets you look around, and I thought that's what the button was actually for. Standing still for long enough recenters the camera behind you too, so a lot of my initial footage for the first 3 worlds or so is not moving at the best pace, or has me dying for pretty stupid reasons, thinking the camera was to blame for more of it than it actually was. I can be an idiot sometimes. Though, sometimes my guesses are also on the mark. Even during the early stages, the structure of the level design being as one-directional as they were, always moving forward across a wide path with obstacles to jump over along the way, it was making me think of Crash Bandicoot in particular. Looking up the staff behind the game revealed that one of the 2 directors for the game was David Siller, who had previously produced the original Crash Bandicoot. Maximo originally started development on the Nintendo 64, so its design roots might have some stronger ties to Crash than the release date would suggest. Also, I don't normally do this, I don't normally interrupt my video with stuff that I've recorded later, but while editing the video I kinda realized that I didn't have any Crash Bandicoot footage ready, so I went to record some, and then I realized how the entire health system from Maximo is basically entirely intact in the old Crash games, where you have 2 tiers of masks, and getting a 3rd mask basically makes you invulnerable for about 10 to 20 seconds. It's pretty much entirely copied over for Maximo. Not a complaint, just an observation, but I found this interesting. This completely escaped me somehow. And if that connection feels strange already, then oh boy, there's a much wilder one. Maximo was made by Capcom Digital Studios, a Western game development studio that's much better known as Capcom Studio 8. And after 2 Maximo games, Studio 8 ended up producing Final Fight Streetwise. They did not have much of a future after that one.
God damn it!
So, do I recommend the original Maximo on PlayStation 2? Yeah, it's a great game. Camera could have used a little bit more work, and the last world or so is pretty brutal. The boss fights aren't too memorable or interesting, though at least the final boss is fantastic visually. It's an easy recommendation if you haven't played it yet and wonder if it's worthwhile to explore next to the traditional Ghosts and Goblins games. Speaking of Ghosts and Goblins, I asked people supporting the channel on Patreon an important question. What's scarier, ghosts or goblins? Ghosts won the poll. Pretty much everyone voted for ghosts. I'm actually not too sure about that. If ghosts really are all they're cracked up to be, why are they so dead? Doesn't sound like they're good at their job, huh? Anyway, this video was brought to you by people supporting the channel on Patreon. If you would like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen right now, or vote in future polls, head over to patreon.com/AboveUp and I will, see ya.